Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 in the Biology module. Today we're going to be discussing a little bit about the endocrine system, and there's a specific reason, of course, why we discuss the nervous system before we discuss the endocrine system, and we'll see why very shortly. So the endocrine system is considered the second major communication system in the body after the nervous system. While the nervous system tends to be very short-acting, very quick to respond, and is responsible for things like immediate sensing and motor control, locomotion, etc., the endocrine system tends to be, you could say, a much more slower but more permanent/gradual method of communication in the body, even though, again, as we'll see, parts of the endocrine system respond very quickly to environmental stimuli. So the endocrine system, while it is not as clean-cut and easy to define as the nervous system, which seems to consist of kind of a single long web of neurons and nerve clusters, the endocrine system is comprised of multiple organs, which we'll see on the next slide, that all communicate via various methods. In fact, many of them communicate with each other via multiple different methods, be it through the nervous system directly or through the bloodstream, or even through sensory input independently. So we'll see a little bit more about that. There are 50 hormones in the body, and they fall into four major categories. As you can see, the four categories there, the ones we're going to be discussing the most, that we'll be discussing today, are the amino acid derived, a little bit about the peptide derived, and a little bit about the steroid hormones. Now, the important thing to remember about each of these is the slight difference in structure of each. Category 1 there, these hormones tend to be single, relatively small molecules that for all intents and purposes look exactly like amino acids. They just have side chains that are changed slightly, so they tend to be small molecules. The second category there are just what they say. Peptide hormones tend to be longer chains of amino acids strung together, much like various proteins, with specific folding which can affect their properties and how they're transported, etc. The third category there are actually made from fats, made from fatty acids. They are modifications of relatively long-chain fatty acids that are folded, modified, shifted around, and take on specific configuration. And the last category there, the steroid hormones, which most of us know about, are ones that are based on that sterol ring, which we all probably recognize at this point from cholesterol and the like. Now, what is interesting to note and what is critical to note about each one of these hormone types is that the size and physical properties of these molecules very much change how the body utilizes them, how they're transported, and how they go to different sites. Because if you think about it, we've discussed a little bit about neurotransmitters, about channels, about hydrophilic and hydrophobic membranes and the like. Depending on what kind of molecule we're talking about, whether it's a polar peptide, like a polar amino acid that can be easily dissolved in water, or a non-polar hydrophobic sort of compound like a fat that can diffuse through a cell membrane on its own, that's going to affect how the cell receives them. For example, if you're looking at an amino acid or a peptide, that can't just make its way through a cell membrane without some sort of transporter. It either needs to bind to the outside of the cell because it's just too big. And remember, it's not just going to flow through a channel protein because those are pretty small channels that usually only let very small molecules through. And it's not just going to diffuse through the membrane. However, steroid molecules, remember cholesterol and other compounds like that, tend to go right through cell membranes because they share similar properties, and cell membranes actually have cholesterol in them. So those are pretty much able to make their way into cells with very little regulation. So that's very important to note, and will be kind of a major theme, of course, as the course goes on and we talk about different hormones. Now, these also affect how they are eliminated by the body. Let's see, if you take a look at some peptide hormones or amino acid-derived hormones, short-acting, fast elimination, which makes sense. Think about something like epinephrine. Epinephrine is released in the body, or it's called adrenaline, circulates through, has very acute effects, and is eliminated very quickly. The body doesn't really want that sticking around very long. Steroid hormones, on the other hand, can get bound to proteins and have longer half-lives. If everyone is familiar with testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin, for example, these compounds and these protein complexes can sit around for a long time in the body, since the effects in a lot of these hormones have very sort of gradual long-term effects on things like, oh gosh, secondary sex characteristic development, menstrual cycles, etc. It makes sense that these compounds would stick around and linger for significantly longer. In other words, fast metabolism and fast elimination is not a priority. So within the body, the major secretory organs of hormones here. Now, the first is the pituitary gland, which we'll see a little diagram of later, located up in the brain. The thyroid, which is located right around the trachea and the neck. The adrenal glands, which are located above the kidneys. The pineal gland, which is also located in the brain. The pancreas, located near the liver. And the testes and ovaries. Now, you can see each one of these glands there is an example of a hormone that is released by each one particularly. Now, what is interesting to note is that many of the hormones released by the pituitary glands actually have an impact on secretion by other organs. For example, we're going to talk a little bit about how the pituitary and the testes, for example, interact. But you also have issues like, you look at how the thyroid interacts. For example, the pituitary releases TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the thyroid to release other hormones. So a lot of these glands actually work in a careful interplay between them all, with the pituitary gland kind of serving as the central, I don't want to say central governor because that's a different term, but a little bit kind of the central command center, along with the hypothalamus for a lot of these things. And the pituitary and the hypothalamus also get feedback from a lot of these other organs. And this is all part of the kind of feedback and control that we're going to discuss a little bit. So the way that hormones work. Now, hormones, given the vast variety we've spoken about, they can work in numerous different ways. So they bind to receptors, and that's, just any sort of signaling molecule in the body has to have something that receives it. And on the cell surface, which we'll see with larger peptide hormones, for example, or potentially inside the cell, which we're actually going to see with some steroid hormones. Now, the next point is critical. The same receptor, I'm reading off the slide, can exist in different cell types in different tissues. Why is this so important? Well, because a lot of hormones have different impacts on different organs and different cell types depending on the cell type. For example, let's talk about testosterone for a moment. And most folks may be familiar with the fact that testosterone has numerous different effects. It builds muscle, but it is also responsible for hair growth. It is also responsible for deepening of the voice. It has certain effects on blood lipids, etc. That's because a lot of cells outside of just skeletal muscle cells have the androgen receptor. The androgen receptor located in skeletal muscle triggers a bunch of anabolic cascades, a bunch of anabolic processes responsible for muscle growth. And for example, in the testes, it stimulates all sorts of different effects there responsible for reproduction and the like. It has an interesting effect when it converts to DHT. A lot of these receptors in hair follicles have different effects. It has different effects in the prostate. So all of these cells contain androgen receptors or DHT receptors, various other receptors that affect what that hormone is doing there. And that is one reason why it's so critical to note that the presence of a receptor in different tissue types doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have the same effect. All right, so as we mentioned, talking about different kinds of receptors, now the peptide amino acid-based hormones, they can't pass through the membrane. So what do they have to do? A lot of them use various, there's one very common system, which is basically what we call a G hormone, G protein, CAMP, cyclical AMP signaling pathway. And we'll see a picture of this on the next slide. It binds to a protein, binds to a membrane receptor on the outside, which causes the release or expression of this G protein inside the cell. So binds to a receptor on the outside. The inside of the receptor activates a secondary signal, which then carries out various effects, which can, depending on whichever sort of, which hormone is attaching where, what kind of cell, etc. So it's effectively the presence of the hormone in the body hits the outside of the cell and, for all intents and purposes, pushes a button on the outside of the cell, which is received by the inside and tells the cell what to do. The second kind, if you look at something like a steroid hormone, it diffuses through the membrane on its own. It doesn't really need much help. It doesn't need to hit a receptor on the outside. What it does do is it hits a receptor on the inside of the cell, often in the cytoplasm. And in the case of, let's talk about the androgen receptor again. It finds this receptor in the cytoplasm, it's bound to that, and the receptor basically takes the testosterone itself, takes the androgen into the nucleus of the cell where it then binds to the DNA directly. So when people talk about, androgen receptors, it's not a receptor on the surface of the cell, it's a receptor in the cytosol. When people talk about, certain kinds of membrane receptors, insulin receptors or whatever else, these are often on the outside of the cell. So remember, the type and structure of these hormones, which again you found in previous slides and you can always look up, determines where they bind. One of the reasons this is so key as well is because, for example, a steroid hormone lingers around in the body for a long period of time, as we've mentioned. When it goes into the cell, a single hormone binds to a single receptor and goes and activates DNA and activates transcription from there. Now, other hormones, if they are just binding to the outside of the cell and effectively pushing a button, which is causing a cascade, it can trigger a cascade that can have much more profound effects in the cell than initiation of transcription of a single protein. This also means that potentially there may be a rate-limiting effect. For example, we talk about androgen receptor saturation when we're talking about, let's say, sport performance and performance-enhancing drugs. We talk about, well, how much testosterone or whatever else is saturating the androgen receptors. Saturating the androgen receptors basically refers to when the amount of androgen receptors inside the cell are effectively all fully spoken for, but beyond that, the amount of transcription sites kind of hits its limit there. So based on the type of protein, whether it's one of these passively diffusing internal receptor direct, having a direct effect on the DNA, or one of these hormones on the surface, you can have different types of intracellular regulation of expression. For example, let's have a look at how they work. So, on the left is this lipid-soluble hormone, like, say, an androgen or anything sterile-based. See how it's just kind of diffusing right through the membrane. Now, note the receptor hormone complex there. Interesting to note is that the presence of other compounds inside the cell, which can vary by cell, can actually change which specific genes that receptor hormone complex is actually transcribing, and that becomes very, very important later. Now, on the right, notice the water-soluble hormone, and we're talking about anything from a amino acid derived to a peptide appearing hormone. Notice how it is binding to the surface of the cell and kind of activating certain downstream processes, which we're going to talk about later. So you see that these can involve activation of existing proteins. They can involve transcription directly. There are a lot of different ways in which these other types of proteins can activate things inside the cell. Just very different processes. You can't really lump each one into a certain bucket and say, well, every amino acid derived hormone has this impact, or et cetera. But just important to note these different mechanisms. Now, one of the most important things about the endocrine system is how it is self-regulating in many ways. So when we talk about hormone control, we talk about upregulation and downregulation, which tends to involve the number of receptors. If we're going to have a cell effectively be able to leverage the presence of more hormone, and basically be able to have more effects, you have to increase the number of receptors. As we saw, for example, with steroid hormones, we talk about upregulation and downregulation of the androgen receptor. For instance, the more androgen receptors you have, the more testosterone you can bind, and therefore the more times that this protein synthesis, this transcription of certain genes will take place. Same thing on the surface of the cell. The more receptors, the more circulating hormone actually can have an impact on the cell itself. And this upregulation and downregulation can occur via a number of reasons. Chronic saturation can affect upregulation and downregulation. It really depends on the hormone system itself. And these can be everything from environmental factors to certain metabolic stressors, et cetera, et cetera. So we talk about upregulation and downregulation. We're effectively talking about the number of receptors more than anything else. Now, the second method is the positive and negative feedback loops. What this basically means is that if a hormone cascade or a hormone process causes the release of certain end products, those end products may actually go back and inhibit or stimulate the expression of certain hormone or pre-hormone releases. Let's see. The hypothalamus up in your brain produces GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. What that does is it goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. Pituitary then produces luteinizing hormone, LH, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. In men and women, they go to different places, as you can see down below. And depending on, and this is actually what's fascinating, in men, when these hormones, for example, a luteinizing hormone goes down to the Leydig cells and produces testosterone. Testosterone, inhibin, and estrogen, or inhibin, are all released at the same time from the Leydig cells. Those all work backwards to inhibit the release of GnRH and LH. Testosterone, I believe, and inhibin, I believe, both go into the pituitary, or both inhibit the release of LH and FSH, and I believe estrogen actually goes back to the hypothalamus, as well as testosterone, by the way, and limits GnRH release. So a lot of these compounds then, as their levels in the bloodstream rise, it slows down the production of that very first kind of triggering hormone. It is also interesting to note that other hormones can affect GnRH release, for example. So ghrelin suppresses GnRH, whereas leptin and insulin activate GnRH. So when we talk about metabolic issues affecting, like, say, testosterone levels or cortisol levels or anything else, it is very, very important to remember that a lot of these hormones, which may seem to have nothing to do with testosterone, for example, or cortisol, anything else, can all work as inhibitors or promoters of hormone expression. So if insulin is an activator of GnRH, that would mean that insulin can actually induce the production of LH and FSH. Well, why would that be of adaptive value? It really, really depends, because you think about, biologically, the presence of food would seem to stimulate testosterone, which indicates the body is in a generally anabolic state. Whereas, anything that is responsible for being released when the body is in a, kind of a catabolic state, it makes sense that a lot of these systems, there's this homeostasis, this, feedback loops that try to regulate and keep the body in a maximum, a maximally balanced sort of state. Now, again, think about certain things like, obesity. Think about, a lot of these other metabolic states where there are all these downstream negative effects. And this is precisely why it is always worth looking at the different sort of regulation and hormone control that goes along with, some of these systems. And this is just a little diagram right here of what the brain looks like, where the hypothalamus is, the pituitary. Pituitary, people call it this little, it looks like a little walnut. I think it looks like something else, but we won't mention that in a professional setting. What is fascinating to note about these things is that the pituitary gland, and in fact a lot of glands in the endocrine system, are technically themselves types of neurons. And we'll see this in the next slide as well. Rather than releasing neurotransmitters, for example, remember when we discussed neurons and we discussed the nervous system, a lot of neurons, when stimulated, they either release, you get either ion release or you get neurotransmitter release at the synapse, at the end of the axon, correct? A lot of these specific glands in the endocrine system are actually modified neurons. But rather than releasing neurotransmitters, they release hormones when they are stimulated. And the pituitary is one such structure. We also have something else to talk about, the adrenal system, for example. Now remember, the adrenals are located right above the kidneys. Now the adrenal system is fascinating because it has two completely different systems kind of located within it. You have the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. And these are all very actually important for kind of sports performance, fitness, and this whole field. Adrenal cortex has 3 segments. It produces mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. Now, as we can see, mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, and other electrolyte or blood pressure regulators. It's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is important because the adrenal cortex is where all of these systems, these hormones that are released that help control things like sodium secretion, sodium reuptake and water reuptake in the kidneys. That whole system is controlled by the adrenal cortex, and those are all mineralocorticoids. That's something we'll discuss much later on when we discuss hydration and the like, but this is where it's found. Glucocorticoids. Cortisol. This is another very important one that we talk about all the time, and we're actually going to discuss a little bit in the next slide. Cortisol is regularly released at very low background levels. However, it is not, the most cortisol is actually released in bursts. ACTH in the pituitary is that upstream signaling mechanism that causes larger amounts of cortisol to be released. That is all known as the HP axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And that is all, again, when we talk about daily fluctuations in cortisol levels, stress-based fluctuations in cortisol, the hypothalamus is one of the things that governs that. It's also important to note that the presence of cortisol has a regulation effect. And if you think about it, remember when we were talking about upstream and downstream regulators, how other hormones can affect these things? Well, you can have the presence of other hormones that go back and either activate or inhibit the release of ACTH from the pituitary. Other thing that the adrenal cortex releases is certain androgens, DHEA, androstenedione, a couple of other precursors, though not terribly relevant for this discussion right now. So that is the outside of the adrenal glands. The inside is the adrenal medulla. Now that itself is another fascinating structure. The adrenal medulla is technically a sort of a ganglion, a nerve ganglion, a nervous cluster, a cluster of nerves that is directly innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, which we, as discussed, is you have the peripheral nervous system, you have the autonomic nervous system, and then the sympathetic nervous system in that. The adrenal medulla, as with the pituitary, technically, the adrenal medulla is a bunch of nerve cells. So is it part of the endocrine system? Is it part of the nervous system? How would you label it? Well, you already get into that point there, where the fact that it secretes hormones, not neurotransmitters, makes it technically part of the endocrine system, but structurally, it's very, very similar. So the adrenal medulla, you have the tyrosine, the amino acid, where it is converted to these compounds called catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. These are all associated with kind of the quote-unquote fight or flight sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal medulla, those cells in there, take tyrosine and convert it to things like epinephrine. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, when those neurons, that whole system is triggered, effectively, remember the whole process of neuron communication where neurons fire and they send out these neurotransmitters to other neurons. In this case, they send it out to quote unquote neurons in the adrenal medulla, which then when they activate, they release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So that is how these work. When people talk about your sympathetic nervous system activating epinephrine, now you know what's actually going on. Also want to quickly touch on another topic. One of the hot topics that's often brought up, especially in health and fitness, is the concept of adrenal fatigue. So kind of knowing what we know a little bit now about feedback, when we talk about adrenal fatigue, one of the things we know about is something called adrenal insufficiency. Well, that's not really what people talk about when they talk about adrenal fatigue, but it's worth discussing because the two are frequently conflated. But adrenal insufficiency is what happens when you don't get enough cortisol release. Because remember, the adrenals, the adrenal cortex produces and secretes cortisol. If you don't have enough cortisol, some of the side effects of that include a lot of things like uncontrolled, you get muscle wasting, you get nausea, headaches, weight loss, so many other things, a whole host of conditions. Now you say, well, why would not enough cortisol cause weight loss? But when a lot of these systems are interrupted, remember that the presence of simply a hormone that is considered quote unquote catabolic like cortisol, when if you're not producing enough of it, you're not getting a lot of this, all of these numerous effects in the body of whether you're talking about necessary nutrient release from muscles, because remember, cortisol when it goes into muscles can cause protein breakdown, but in part that is to help fuel other biological constructive processes. So not enough cortisol has a whole host of negative side effects that can be absolutely terrible if not treated. Addison's disease is an autoimmune adrenal disease that basically causes adrenal insufficiency, causes damage to a lot of those cells that are responsible for creating and releasing cortisol, so it can cause adrenal insufficiency. You can actually get, via traumatic brain injury or head injury, secondary adrenal insufficiency. Now, a TBI can technically cause adrenal insufficiency. Remember that feedback loop where you have to get, remember the whole ACTH system, and we talk about the HPA axis. Well, if the hypothalamus and the pituitary are somehow damaged, whether by TBI or brain injury, brain tumor, or anything like that, without ACTH being secreted, the adrenal glands are not going to be producing or secreting enough cortisol as well. So remember, this is all getting into how this entire system ties together. Third way, now remember when systems tie together, we also talk about feedback. If you've been taking corticosteroids for a long period of time, what you're going to get is gradual down regulation. You're going to get, first of all, you're going to get feedback inhibition, where the hypothalamus and pituitary detect large amounts of cortisol, and because there's a negative feedback loop there, they stop sending signals to the adrenal glands to produce cortisol of its own. Over time, what you start to get is you get downregulation of the number of receptors, and that whole system on its own tends to slow down. If you suddenly stop taking corticosteroids, your body is going to take a long time to start producing more. So by looking at the endocrine system and this desire to kind of maintain homeostasis and how everything kind of works in multiple different inhibition activation, you can see how issues with any one of these areas, whether the adrenals themselves, the brain, the presence of external hormones, all of these things can cause similar issues. So this is again, when we talk about hormones or hormone feedback, it's so much more complicated than just looking at the target organ. Of course, when people talk about adrenal fatigue, one of the things they talk about is how high periods of stress may lead to kind of adrenal burnout and adrenal insufficiency. The problem is high stress creates cortisol. So cortisol production is actually upregulated, not downregulated. Adrenal fatigue as a condition. Now, we do a disservice by saying it doesn't exist. Because when we think about any sort of long-term chronic disease or chronic disease state, whether it be adrenal fatigue or, we talk about how, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome, we tend to discuss a series of seemingly related symptoms that don't have one specific cause. And we lump them into kind of a bucket. But hopefully what we're starting to demonstrate here is just how complicated any one of these systems are, and how feedback loops, especially in the endocrine system, the presence of one seemingly unrelated hormone can cause a negative feedback loop in a seemingly unrelated system, like insulin and GnRH, for example. So while adrenal fatigue doesn't actually jibe with any of the actual symptoms of adrenal insufficiency or adrenal quote-unquote burnout, there may still be an underlying condition here. So while adrenal fatigue has the opposite presentation to adrenal insufficiency, and therefore it can't possibly be a burnout of the adrenals, there is potentially something going on with these individuals. So that's just a general introduction to the endocrine system. We are going to be discussing some of these hormones directly. For example, We'll be delving quite a bit into testosterone. We'll be delving quite a bit into the menstrual cycle and its impact on training. We'll be talking about aldosterone, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and all of those when we talk about nutrition. But it is worth, again, going through this entire segment and going through the segments in the textbook that cover this. And again, looking at the interplay of these systems, looking at how these, at the communication, and even just appreciating how the endocrine system and the nervous system, all of them interplay. There are still blurry definitions between the two. The nerve cells are part of the endocrine system, and all of that comes together. It's wonderfully complicated. It's wonderfully interesting, and there is so much more going on here than I think many of us give it credit for.